Jack Thompson stood at the head of the mahogany conference table in his penthouse office, surrounded by the city's elite business leaders. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind him showcased the sprawling metropolis he helped shape through his real estate empire. His custom-made Italian suit and gold watch weren't just accessories, they were statements of power. "Success isn't given, it's taken," Jack declared to his attentive audience, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never faced real adversity. The room hung on his every word as he detailed his latest development project, a luxury high-rise that would replace an aging apartment complex. When someone raised concerns about displaced residents, Jack dismissed them with a practiced wave of his hand. "Progress requires sacrifice," he said, drawing knowing nods from his colleagues. "We're not running a charity, we're running a business." The comment earned appreciative chuckles from around the table. Jack's disdain for social issues wasn't just apparent, it was part of his brand. He prided himself on being practical and realistic, terms he used to justify his cutthroat approach to business. Meanwhile, in a modest apartment across town, Aaliyah sat on her worn couch, staring at the positive pregnancy test in her trembling hands. The small living room, neat but showing signs of wear, felt suddenly smaller. The evening light filtering through thin curtains cast long shadows across the floor, matching her growing anxiety. "What am I going to do, Mama?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother, Sarah, sat beside her, weathered hands clasping her daughter's. Unlike the cold luxury of Jack's world, their home was warm with the smell of cooking and the weight of generations of struggle and perseverance. "You're stronger than you know, baby," Sarah assured her, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had faced similar challenges. "We come from women who never gave up, no matter what life threw at them." She shared stories of Aaliyah's grandmother, who raised 5 children alone while working 2 jobs, and her great-grandmother, who fought for workers' rights in the 1960s. The conversation with her mother filled Aaliyah with a determined resolve. She would face this challenge head-on, just as the women before her had done. She began making plans, calculating expenses, and thinking about how to tell her employer. The moment of truth came sooner than expected. Jack's reaction to the news of Aaliyah's pregnancy was swift and cold. In his home office, surrounded by awards and photographs of himself with celebrities and politicians, he didn't even look up from his computer screen as he delivered the news of her termination. "Your services will no longer be required," he stated flatly, as if discussing the weather. "You'll receive 2 weeks' severance pay." When Aaliyah tried to explain her situation, Jack cut her off with a raised hand. "This is a business decision, nothing personal. I'm sure you understand." The contrast between them couldn't have been starker, Jack in his tailored suit, protected by wealth and privilege, and Aaliyah in her simple uniform, her hand unconsciously moving to protect her unborn child. For Jack, this was just another day, another decision to maintain his carefully controlled world. He didn't see the tremor in Aaliyah's hands or the tears she fought to hold back. As Aaliyah left the mansion for the last time, Jack had already moved on to his next meeting, the incident already forgotten in his mind. He failed to notice the quiet dignity with which she carried herself or the strength beginning to build in her eyes. In his world of power moves and profit margins, there was no room for understanding the impact of his actions on others' lives. In a gleaming skyscraper's executive floor, Jack Thompson commanded attention during his quarterly business meeting. His steel gray suit cost more than what most people earned in a month, and he knew it. The conference room buzzed with anticipation as he presented his latest real estate acquisition plans. "Gentlemen, success isn't about being liked, it's about being feared and respected," Jack declared, clicking through slides showing property valuations. His audience, composed of board members and investors, nodded in agreement. They all knew Jack's reputation for aggressive business tactics and unprecedented returns. "Our Q3 profits have exceeded projections by 47%, he continued, deliberately pausing for effect. "And Q4 looks even better." The room erupted in approving murmurs. Jack savored these moments, where his power was undisputed and his word was law. When a junior board member raised concerns about displaced families from their latest development project, Jack's response was swift and cutting. "We're not running a charity here. The market doesn't care about feelings." The questioner shrank back, effectively silenced. Meanwhile, in a small apartment across town, Aaliyah sat on her bathroom floor, staring at 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone to call her mother. The contrast between her world and Jack's couldn't have been starker. "Mama, I need you," she whispered into the phone. Within an hour, her mother arrived, bringing warmth and strength to the small space. They sat at Aaliyah's kitchen table, where the overhead light flickered occasionally, another repair she couldn't yet afford. "I'm scared, Mama," Aaliyah admitted, her voice steady despite her fear. "But I want this baby." Her mother reached across the table, gripping her daughter's hand firmly. "Your grandmother raised 5 children by herself, working 2 jobs," her mother reminded her. "She didn't have much, but she had determination. That's in your blood too." The words weren't meant as poetry, they were a statement of fact, a reminder of their family's resilience. Aaliyah spent that night planning. She calculated her savings, researched pregnancy resources, and made lists of necessary preparations. Her practical approach to the situation reflected her character, methodical, responsible, and determined. The next morning, Aaliyah arrived at Jack's mansion early, as she had every day for the past 3 years. She cleaned methodically while gathering her courage to share the news. When Jack finally emerged from his home office around noon, she seized her opportunity. "Mr. Thompson, I need to discuss something important with you," she began, standing straight despite her nervousness. Jack barely looked up from his phone. "Make it quick." "I have a meeting in 20 minutes, he replied, his attention divided. "I'm pregnant, sir," Aaliyah stated directly. "I wanted to discuss my maternity leave options." Jack's reaction was immediate. His face hardened, and he finally looked directly at her. "That won't be necessary," he said coldly. "Consider this your 2 weeks' notice. HR will process your final payment." The dismissal was swift and brutal. Jack didn't raise his voice or show anger, he didn't need to. His power lay in his ability to destroy someone's livelihood with the same emotion he'd show while ordering coffee. "But sir, I've worked here for 3 years, Aaliyah protested, maintaining her composure. "I'm a good employee." "We're a good employee," Jack corrected, already turning away. "You'll receive 2 weeks severance. That's more than generous. We're done here." He walked away, leaving Aaliyah standing in his spotless kitchen, a kitchen she had maintained meticulously for years. The silence that followed was deafening. Jack returned to his office, already focused on his next meeting, while Aaliyah gathered her few personal belongings. As she left the mansion for the last time, Jack was already dictating emails about property acquisitions, her dismissal nothing more than a minor administrative task completed. He didn't see her straighten her shoulders as she walked out, didn't notice the determination replacing the shock in her eyes. The day ended with 2 contrasting scenes: Jack at his penthouse bar, celebrating another successful business deal with expensive scotch, and Aaliyah at her kitchen table, methodically planning her next steps with a cup of tea growing cold beside her. Neither knew that this day would set in motion events that would eventually force them to confront their shared humanity. After her dismissal, Aaliyah's life transformed rapidly. Her small apartment, once a source of pride, became an impossible expense. Each bill arrival brought fresh anxiety. She sat at her kitchen table, calculator in hand, running numbers that refused to add up favorably. The pregnancy complications started subtly, first with severe morning sickness that left her unable to work full days at temporary jobs, then with concerning blood pressure readings that required frequent medical visits. Each doctor's appointment depleted her dwindling savings, the numbers in her bank account dropping as steadily as her anxiety rose. "I can give you until the end of the month," her landlord said, showing unexpected patience but unable to extend further flexibility. Aaliyah nodded, knowing she had already stretched his goodwill thin. The walls of her apartment seemed to close in as she packed her belongings into cardboard boxes borrowed from local stores. The women's shelter wasn't what she expected. Clean but sparse, it housed other women in similar situations, some escaping abuse, others, like her, simply caught in life's cruel timing. Her room, shared with another expectant mother, offered basic necessities: a bed, a small dresser, and a window overlooking a concrete courtyard. "You're lucky to get in here," the intake worker told her. "We usually have a waiting list." Aaliyah understood the truth behind those words. She was both fortunate and unfortunate to need this place. Meanwhile, Jack Thompson's life continued its upward trajectory. He hosted lavish parties in his penthouse, each more extravagant than the last. The dismissal of a pregnant housekeeper never crossed his mind, it was merely one of countless decisions he made daily. "You've outdone yourself, Jack," a business associate commented at his latest soiree. gesturing at the ice sculpture centerpiece and the uniformed wait staff circulating with champagne. Jack smiled, accepting the compliment as his due. Yet something felt hollow about these celebrations. Late at night, when the parties ended and the guests departed, Jack sometimes stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city he was helping to reshape. Occasional moments of unease crept in, fleeting thoughts about the human cost of his success that he quickly drowned in aged scotch. Aaliyah's days took on a new rhythm at the shelter. She woke early, joining the line for the communal bathroom, then headed out to search for work. The pregnancy made finding employment challenging. Few wanted to hire someone who would need maternity leave in a few months. She found sporadic work cleaning houses, though the irony wasn't lost on her. Some employers would visibly hesitate upon seeing her pregnancy, their eyes moving from her growing belly to their expensive possessions. Others would hire her but watch her constantly, as if pregnancy might be contagious. Just temporary, she reminded herself during particularly difficult days. This is just temporary. The mantra became her touchstone, something to hold on to when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. The contrast between their lives couldn't have been starker. While Jack flew to exotic locations for weekend getaways, Aaliyah counted bus tokens, calculating if she could afford the trip to her next doctor's appointment. While he dined at exclusive restaurants, she learned to make her shelter meals stretch, sharing with other residents who had even less. Yet something was shifting. Jack's parties grew more frequent but less satisfying. He found himself avoiding quiet moments, filling them with noise and activity. The ghost of an uncomfortable feeling, not quite guilt, but something adjacent to it, began to haunt his quieter moments. At one particularly lavish event, a drunk guest mentioned a news story about homeless pregnant women. "Can you imagine?" the guest slurred, waving his champagne glass. "In our city." Jack felt an unexpected twist in his stomach, quickly dismissed as indigestion from the canapés. Aaliyah, meanwhile, discovered unexpected strength in her circumstances. She began attending the shelter's free counseling sessions, where she met other women who had rebuilt their lives from similar situations. Their stories became her blueprint, their successes her possibility. She started documenting her experiences in a notebook borrowed from the shelter's donation box. What began as a way to process her emotions evolved into something more, a record of systemic inequality and resilience. The words flowed easily, capturing both the practical challenges and the emotional toll of her situation. The shelter's social worker noticed her writing. "Your story could help others," she suggested, pointing out local advocacy groups that might be interested. Aaliyah tucked this information away, a seed planted for future growth. The days stretched into weeks, and weeks into months. While Jack's empire continued to expand, built on decisions that prioritized profit over people, Aaliyah's world contracted to essential concerns: health, shelter, and preparation for her child's arrival. Yet in this contraction, she found an expanding sense of purpose. 7 years passed, reshaping both lives in unexpected ways. Jack Thompson's empire grew exponentially. His company now occupied 3 floors of a downtown skyscraper, his name emblazoned across the building's facade in illuminated letters. Yet despite his mounting success, something had changed in him. During a board meeting, Jack found himself distracted by the view from his corner office. Below, construction crews worked on his latest development project, another luxury apartment complex. "Mr. Thompson." His assistant's voice pulled him back. "They're waiting for your decision on the displacement compensation package." He nodded automatically, approving the minimum required by law. But for the first time, he noticed the slight frown on his assistant's face before she turned away. These moments of disconnection had become more frequent. His mansion, filled with expensive art and designer furniture, felt increasingly empty despite its opulence. His family life reflected this hollowness. Breakfast with his wife and children had become a silent affair, everyone absorbed in their phones or tablets. His teenage daughter barely acknowledged him, and his son seemed to exist primarily through credit card statements from exclusive private schools. "Daddy, why don't you ever come to my recitals anymore?" his daughter had asked recently. Jack couldn't remember when he'd stopped attending. The calendar on his phone was packed with business meetings, but personal events had somehow slipped away. Meanwhile, Aaliyah had transformed her struggle into purpose. The small community center where she organized meetings buzzed with energy as domestic workers gathered to share experiences and plan actions. Her son, now 6 years old, played quietly in the corner, surrounded by books and toys donated by supporters. We need to make them see us as human beings, Aaliyah addressed the group, her voice carrying the weight of experience. The room was filled with women who shared similar stories of arbitrary dismissals, unpaid overtime, and workplace discrimination. What had started as informal support meetings had evolved into a movement. Local media had begun to take notice. A reporter from the city newspaper sat in the back of the room, taking notes as Aaliyah outlined their demands for better working conditions and legal protections. Her articulate presentation of their cause made compelling headlines. "Domestic Workers Fight for Rights," read the morning paper's headline. Jack's eyes caught the article during his morning routine, something in the photograph accompanying it tugging at his memory. He quickly turned the page, but the image lingered, a woman speaking passionately to a crowd, her face somehow familiar. The movement gained momentum. Aaliyah found herself speaking at community events, then at city council meetings. Her personal story became a rallying point, but she was careful to emphasize that it wasn't just about her. "This is about dignity," she would say. About recognizing the humanity in all work. Her son grew up in this atmosphere of activism and community. He inherited his mother's quiet strength and determination, excelling in school despite their modest circumstances. The community they'd built supported them, creating a network of care and mutual aid that money couldn't buy. Jack's world, in contrast, grew more isolated. His success brought increased security measures, more layers between him and the outside world. During one particularly sleepless night, he wandered through his empty house, past rooms filled with unused furniture and unopened art pieces. In his home office, he found himself looking at old photographs. His company's early days, when he still knew every employee's name. When had that changed? When had people become numbers on spreadsheets rather than faces he recognized? The moment of reflection was interrupted by a late-night email about another acquisition opportunity. Jack turned to his computer, pushing away the uncomfortable thoughts. But they returned in quiet moments, like unwanted guests that couldn't be permanently evicted. Aaliyah's organization planned their largest demonstration yet, a march for domestic workers' rights that would pass directly in front of major corporate headquarters, including Jack's building. The irony wasn't lost on her, but personal vindication had long since ceased to be her primary motivation. The media coverage increased. Local channels picked up the story, and then national ones. Aaliyah found herself being interviewed, carefully articulating their cause to increasingly larger audiences. Her story resonated because it was both personal and universal, a story of power, inequality, and the fight for dignity. On a crisp autumn morning, Jack Thompson found himself drawn to Memorial Park. His therapist had suggested grounding activities, though he hadn't admitted to anyone he was seeing a therapist. The park represented a simpler time when he used to bring his own children here, before business consumed his life. He sat on a bench, watching families interact. His custom-made suit felt oddly out of place among the casual weekend crowd. A group of children played near the vintage carousel, their laughter carrying across the playground. Something about their uninhibited joy made his chest tighten uncomfortably. As he observed the scene, a particular boy caught his attention. The child, around 7 years old, was helping a younger girl on the swing set. What struck Jack wasn't just the boy's kindness, but something familiar in his features. The child wore a distinctive ring on a chain around his neck, a ring that made Jack's breath catch. The ring was unmistakable, a Thompson family heirloom he'd lost years ago. It had disappeared during a house cleaning, and he'd accused several staff members before eventually giving up the search. The incident had cost him 3 housekeepers and contributed to his reputation as a difficult employer. Jack found himself moving closer to the playground, drawn by an inexplicable need to confirm what he was seeing. The boy's profile, the way he carried himself, even his gestures seemed to awaken something in Jack's memory. But it was the eyes, those eyes reminded him of someone. "That's a special ring you're wearing," Jack said, approaching carefully to avoid appearing threatening. The boy looked up, revealing a face that seemed to blend features Jack saw in his mirror with ones he'd tried to forget. "It was my mom's," the boy replied with a directness that felt familiar. "She found it when she was cleaning a big house. She says it reminds her that everything happens for a reason." The child's articulate response carried no hint of the resentment his mother might harbor. Jack felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The timing aligned perfectly. 7 years had passed since Aaliyah's dismissal. The boy's age, the ring, the resemblance that had nagged at him, reality crashed over him like a cold wave. "What's your name?" Jack asked, his voice barely steady. "Marcus," the boy answered. "Marcus Williams. My mom's over there." He pointed toward a woman sitting on a nearby bench, engrossed in paperwork spread across her lap. Jack recognized her immediately, though she'd changed. Aaliyah looked more confident, more composed, but unmistakably the same woman he'd dismissed years ago. The weight of his past actions hit him with physical force. This child, this bright, kind boy, could have grown up in privilege. Instead, Jack's decision had forced him and his mother into what he could only imagine had been years of hardship. As Jack stood frozen in this realization, Marcus continued chatting innocently about school, his friends, and his mother's work helping other house cleaners get treated fairly. Each word added to the growing weight of Jack's conscience. "My mom says everyone deserves respect," Marcus said, wise beyond his years. "Even rich people who don't always show it to others." The simple statement, delivered without malice, struck deeper than any calculated accusation could have. Jack noticed Aaliyah looking up from her papers, her expression changing as she recognized him. The years of distance evaporated in that moment. He saw the flash of recognition, followed by something harder, a protective instinct as she quickly gathered her things and started moving toward them. The approaching confrontation felt inevitable, like watching a slow-motion collision. Jack remained rooted to the spot, unable to retreat, unable to advance. Everything he'd built, all his success and power, felt hollow in the face of this unexpected encounter. Aaliyah moved across the park with purposeful strides, her body language transforming from relaxed to defensive. The papers she'd been reviewing, draft legislation for domestic workers' rights, were clutched tightly in her hands like a shield. "Marcus, come here," she called out, her voice steady but tight with tension. The boy looked between his mother and Jack, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere but not understanding its source. He reluctantly moved away from the playground, still wearing the ring that had triggered this collision of past and present. "Mrs. Williams," Jack started, attempting to maintain his usual authoritative tone but finding it failing him. "I had no idea. It's Ms." Aaliyah cut him off sharply. "And you lost the right to address me at all 7 years ago." Her words carried the weight of years of practiced responses to imagined encounters, but the reality felt different from her rehearsals. Marcus looked confused. "Mom, this nice man was just asking about your ring." His innocent comment made both adults flinch. The ring around his neck caught the sunlight, a glinting reminder of their shared history. "Marcus, please go play with Sarah for a few minutes," Aaliyah directed, nodding toward his friend on the swings. She waited until he was out of earshot before turning back to Jack. "What do you want, Mr. Thompson?" "Coming to check on your property." Her gesture toward the ring was pointed. Jack struggled to find words, a new experience for someone who commanded boardrooms. "I didn't know he was." "I never knew you were." He trailed off, realizing how inadequate any response would be. "That I was pregnant with your child when you fired me." Aaliyah's voice remained low but intense. Would it have made a difference? Would the great Jack Thompson have shown mercy if he'd known he was dismissing the mother of his child? The park continued its weekend activities around them, children laughing, parents chatting, dogs barking, creating a surreal backdrop to their confrontation. Jack was acutely aware of his expensive suit, his carefully maintained appearance, all the trappings of power that suddenly meant nothing. "I want to make this right," he said, reaching for his wallet instinctively, his usual solution to problems. Aaliyah's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Make it right? With what? Money? Your money didn't help Marcus through nights of fever. It didn't help when we lived in a shelter. It didn't help when I had to choose between buying food and paying rent." Each statement hit like a physical blow. Jack glanced at Marcus, seeing him now with new eyes, his son, playing without any awareness of his heritage or birthright. "He's my son," he said quietly, more to himself than to Aaliyah. "No," Aaliyah's response was immediate and firm. "He's my son. You're just the man who fired his pregnant mother. Biology doesn't make you a father." The truth of her words struck him with unexpected force. He had other children, privileged, distant children he barely knew despite living under the same roof. Now he had another child he'd never known at all. "Please," he tried again, "at least let me explain." "Explain what?" Aaliyah interrupted. "How you've changed. How sorry you are. Save it for your PR team, Mr. Thompson. We've done fine without you, and we'll continue to do fine. As if to underscore her point, Marcus ran back to them, grinning proudly. Mom, Sarah says her mom's coming to your meeting tomorrow. That's another signature for your petition, right? Aaliyah's expression softened as she looked at her son, then hardened again as she turned back to Jack. We're leaving, Marcus. Say goodbye to Mr. Thompson. The boy waved cheerfully, oblivious to the tension. Bye. Thanks for asking about Mom's ring. Jack watched them walk away, feeling more powerless than he had in decades. The distance between them seemed to represent everything he'd built his empire on: privilege, power, and the casual cruelty of treating people as disposable. In his private office after the park encounter, Jack sat in darkness, a glass of untouched scotch on his desk. The city light sparkled beyond his windows, but he saw nothing except the image of Marcus wearing that ring, his family's ring, around his neck. He'd arranged an emergency session with his therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, breaking his usual pattern of carefully scheduled appointments. I have a son, he said without preamble. A 7-year-old boy I never knew existed. Dr. Chen listened as Jack recounted the park encounter, his voice occasionally breaking. I keep thinking about that ring, he said. She could have sold it, it's worth thousands. Instead, she kept it, gave it to him. What does that say about her? About me? What do you think it says? Dr. Chen asked, her notepad untouched. This wasn't a session for notes. Meanwhile, Aaliyah sat in her modest apartment, watching Marcus sleep. The encounter with Jack had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. She pulled out her journal, a habit she'd maintained since her shelter days, and began writing. How do I protect him from this, she wrote. How do I protect him from the truth without lying to him? The questions felt impossible to answer. Back in his office, Jack began researching. He spent hours reading about Aaliyah's advocacy work, watching videos of her speeches, learning about the movement she'd built. The woman he dismissed years ago had become a force for change, while he'd remained static in his tower of privilege. He made his decision at dawn. Calling his PR team, he began outlining a new initiative, a comprehensive program supporting domestic workers' rights. His staff was surprised but efficiently began developing proposals. No, Jack interrupted their initial presentation. We're not handling this internally. We need to work with existing organizations, specifically, Ms. Williams' coalition. His team exchanged glances. Sir, given your history with Ms. Williams Exactly because of that history, Jack cut in. We need to do this right, not just right for our image. Aaliyah received the formal invitation to collaborate on a worker rights initiative with surprise and skepticism. The Thompson Corporation logo on the letterhead made her initial reaction a firm no. But then she looked deeper into the proposal. The suggested programs were comprehensive: healthcare benefits, educational support, legal aid, childcare assistance. Everything her organization had been fighting for, backed by serious financial commitment. It's a trap, her colleague Maria insisted. Corporate whitewashing. Maybe, Aaliyah agreed. But what if it's not? What if we could actually make real change? She spent days analyzing the proposal, looking for hidden catches. The funding was clean, no strings attached. The implementation would be overseen by her organization. The Thompson Corporation would provide resources but not control. Jack, meanwhile, immersed himself in understanding the issues. He read academic papers on domestic worker rights, studied successful programs in other countries, and most importantly, began examining his own behavior as an employer. During one late night at the office, he found himself staring at a photograph of his other children. When was the last time he'd had a real conversation with them? Had he treated them as accessories to his success, just as he'd treated his employees as tools? He started therapy sessions twice weekly, working through decades of inherited privilege and learned behaviors. My grandfather treated his staff the same way, he realized during one session. I never questioned it. I just continued the pattern. The work was uncomfortable, forcing him to confront ugly truths about himself and his industry. But for the first time in years, he felt something genuine stirring inside him, a desire for real change, not just profit. Aaliyah finally agreed to a meeting, but on her terms, at her organization's office, with her full board present. When Jack arrived, wearing a simple suit rather than his usual designer attire, she noticed the change immediately. Something in his demeanor was different, less artificial, more human. The decision to attend the conference weighed heavily on Aaliyah. She sat in her small home office, surrounded by case files of domestic workers who had faced similar discrimination. The invitation from Thompson Corporation lay open on her desk, printed on expensive paper that felt foreign between her fingers. "It's an opportunity to reach thousands," her colleague Maria pointed out during their strategy meeting. "But it's also very public, very personal. Are you ready for that?" Aaliyah thought of Marcus, now asking more questions about his father. The conference would make their story public knowledge. There would be no going back to the relative anonymity they'd maintained. Meanwhile, Jack threw himself into conference preparations with unprecedented personal involvement. His staff was startled to find him attending planning meetings he would normally have delegated. "I want full sponsorship packages for smaller organizations," he instructed his team. "Remove all attendance fees. Provide transportation stipends. Make it accessible." His CFO shifted uncomfortably at the mounting costs, but Jack remained firm. He spent hours studying the issues, often late into the night. His desk became cluttered with reports on domestic worker conditions, statistical analyses, and personal testimonies. The ring's empty spot in his family safe served as a constant reminder of what was at stake. "The keynote speech needs to be authentic," he told his speechwriter. "No corporate jargon. No sanitized version." When the first draft came back too polished, he began writing it himself, something he hadn't done in years. Aaliyah prepared differently. She organized focus groups with domestic workers, collecting their stories, ensuring their voices would be heard. Her speech would not just be her story, but a tapestry of shared experiences. "Tell them about the night shifts," one worker urged, "about missing our children's school events because we're caring for other people's children." Each testimony added layers to the narrative she was building. Jack's research led him to uncomfortable discoveries about his own company's practices. He initiated internal audits of employee treatment, focusing particularly on service staff. The results were sobering. "We need to address these issues before the conference," he insisted to his board. "We can't advocate for change while perpetuating the same problems." Some board members resisted, but Jack's resolve had hardened into something unfamiliar to them: genuine conviction. Aaliyah received updates about the conference preparations with mixed emotions. The scope of the event exceeded her expectations: international speakers, media coverage, policy makers in attendance. Her organization would have unprecedented exposure. But at what cost, she wondered aloud during a late-night call with her mother. "Am I using our story for the right reasons?" "Your story stopped being just yours the moment you started fighting for others," her mother reminded her. "Now it belongs to the movement." Jack struggled with his own preparations. Each practice run of his speech felt inadequate. How do you apologize for years of systematic disregard? How do you acknowledge privilege without sounding condescending? He hired experts in labor rights to train his senior management. Many resigned rather than adapt to the new direction. Jack saw each resignation as confirmation that change was necessary. Marcus, curious about the increasing activity around his mother, asked questions she struggled to answer. "Why is this conference so important, Mom?" he asked one evening. "And why do you look worried instead of excited?" The conference date approached with mounting tension. Media began speculating about the unprecedented collaboration between a corporate giant and grassroots activists. Some praised it as revolutionary, others predicted it would compromise the movement's integrity. Aaliyah finally decided to video record her speech, practiced it alone at night, watching herself deliver the words that would expose their personal history to the world. Each run-through felt like ripping open old wounds, but also like finally letting them properly heal. The conference center buzzed with an energy that felt different from typical corporate events. Domestic workers in their everyday clothes mixed with executives in business suits, creating a visual representation of the divide the conference aimed to address. Jack stood backstage, adjusting his tie for the 10th time. He'd deliberately chosen a modest suit, avoiding his usual designer brands. His prepared speech felt heavy in his hands, though he'd memorized every word. 5 minutes, Mr. Thompson, an event coordinator announced. Through the curtain, he could hear the murmur of the packed auditorium. Every major media outlet was present, along with policymakers, activists, and hundreds of domestic workers. When Jack stepped onto the stage, the silence was immediate and heavy. The bright lights made it difficult to see the audience, but he knew Aaliyah was there, seated in the front row with other movement leaders. "I've given thousands of speeches," he began, his voice steady. "About real estate developments, profit margins, and corporate expansion. But I've never given a speech about being wrong." The audience stirred at this unexpected opening. He continued, abandoning his prepared notes. "7 years ago, I fired a pregnant employee without a second thought. I treated her as disposable, just another line item to be removed from a spreadsheet. That decision revealed everything wrong with how we treat domestic workers." In the audience, Aaliyah sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. This public acknowledgement of their history felt surreal. "That employee," Jack continued, his voice thick with emotion, "went on to build something I never could with all my wealth. She built a movement based on dignity, respect, and basic human rights. While I was adding zeros to my bank account, she was adding value to people's lives." The silence in the hall grew deeper. Some audience members began connecting the dots, looking between Jack and Aaliyah. "Today, we're announcing the creation of the Domestic Workers' Rights Foundation, with an initial endowment of $50 million. Gasps rippled through the audience. "But more importantly, we're announcing a complete restructuring of how the Thompson Corporation treats all employees, starting with our domestic staff." When it was Aaliyah's turn to speak, she walked to the podium with measured steps. The room had barely recovered from Jack's revelations. "7 years ago, I cleaned houses to survive," she began. "Today, I stand here not just as a survivor, but as a voice for thousands who still face what I faced." Her voice gained strength as she spoke. She shared her journey, the shelter, the struggle, the building of a movement. But she also shared the dignity she'd found in fighting for change. "This isn't about charity," she emphasized. "It's about fundamental rights and respect." The audience responded with increasing emotion as she spoke. Many domestic workers were openly crying, seeing their own experiences reflected in her words. Corporate executives shifted uncomfortably, perhaps seeing their own behaviors mirrored in Jack's confession. The climax came when she addressed Jack's revelation directly. "Mr. Thompson's acknowledgement today isn't just about personal redemption. It's about recognizing systemic wrongs and taking concrete steps to correct them." The standing ovation that followed her speech lasted several minutes. Workers, executives, and activists stood together, united in a moment of shared purpose and possibility. After the conference, Aaliyah and Jack met in a small private room away from the media frenzy. The space felt charged with unspoken words and years of history. Through the window, they could see reporters gathering outside the conference center. "That was quite a speech," Aaliyah said, breaking the silence. She stood by the window, maintaining physical distance between them. $50 million is a significant commitment. "It's not enough," Jack replied, remaining near the door. "But it's a start." He pulled out a folder from his briefcase. "The foundation will be independently run. I'd like you to head it." Aaliyah turned to face him fully. "You're not trying to buy forgiveness, are you, Jack?" "No," he answered honestly. "I'm trying to make actual change. The foundation needs someone who understands the real issues, not just the corporate perspective." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock. Marcus's babysitter had brought him to the conference center as planned. The boy burst into the room, excited from watching parts of the event on the venue's overflow screens. "Mom, you were amazing." He stopped short when he saw Jack, recognition flickering across his face. "Oh, hello again, Mr. Thompson." The moment hung heavy in the air. Jack looked at Aaliyah, a question in his eyes. She gave a slight nod. "Marcus," she said carefully, "there's something we need to talk about." She guided him to a chair, sitting beside him. "Remember how you asked about your father?" The next hour was filled with careful explanations, questions, and emotions. Marcus listened with surprising maturity, asking thoughtful questions that sometimes left both adults struggling for answers. "So the ring," Marcus touched the chain around his neck, "was a sign," Aaliyah finished, "that everything has its time." Jack stayed relatively quiet, letting Aaliyah lead the conversation. When he did speak, it was with humility that would have been unimaginable years ago. "I'd like to know you, Marcus," he said finally. "If and when you're ready. On your terms." Later that week, they met to discuss the foundation's structure. The meeting room was neutral territory, not Jack's corporate office or Aaliyah's community center. "We need to address healthcare first," Aaliyah insisted, spreading out documentation. "Too many workers can't afford basic medical care." Jack listened, really listened, taking notes and asking relevant questions. His corporate experience, when applied to actually helping people, proved valuable in unexpected ways. "What about a partnership with local clinics?" he suggested. "We could fund expanded hours, multilingual staff." The planning sessions became regular meetings. They were professional but not cold, focused but not rigid. Both brought their expertise, Aaliyah's ground-level understanding and Jack's corporate knowledge. Marcus sometimes joined them, doing homework in a corner of the meeting room. His presence served as a constant reminder of why their work mattered. "He has your business sense," Aaliyah admitted one day, watching Marcus methodically organize his school supplies. "But he has my determination." The foundation's first initiatives launched within months. Free legal clinics for domestic workers. Emergency housing assistance. Educational programs. Each program was carefully designed with input from the workers themselves. At the foundation's first major board meeting, Jack stood before a diverse group of stakeholders, corporate leaders, domestic workers representatives, and advocacy groups. The boardroom, unlike traditional corporate spaces, had been designed to feel welcoming and accessible. "Before we begin," Jack announced, "there's something everyone needs to understand about why this foundation exists." He looked at Aaliyah, who nodded slightly. "It's time to share the full story." Jack pulled up a family photograph on the presentation screen, a black and white image from the 1950s showing his grandfather's mansion and staff. "This is where it began for me," he said. "My grandfather, William Thompson, built his fortune on the backs of domestic workers he exploited." The room grew silent as Jack revealed the dark history he'd recently uncovered through his personal investigation. He employed primarily immigrant women, paying them far below minimum wage, threatening deportation if they complained. One of those women was Aaliyah's grandmother. This revelation caused a stir in the room. Aaliyah stood up, joining Jack at the front. "My grandmother worked in the Thompson household for 20 years, she continued. She was one of many who suffered in silence." Jack displayed more documents, old payment records, correspondence, and photographs he'd found in his family's archives. "The ring that Marcus wears, it belonged to my grandmother. She gave it to my grandfather's housekeeper, Maria Santos, as a gesture of kindness." Maria was Aaliyah's grandmother. The connection between their families, spanning generations, suddenly became clear to everyone present. What had seemed like a random incident of workplace discrimination was revealed to be part of a larger pattern, a cycle that had finally been broken. "This foundation," Jack declared, "isn't just about correcting current injustices. It's about acknowledging and healing generational wounds. The exploitation of domestic workers isn't new, it's deeply rooted in our society's history." Aaliyah shared her own discovery, journal entries from her grandmother that documented both the hardships and small acts of resistance. "When I found these," she said, "I understood why my mother was so determined that I would never work in domestic service. But life had other plans." The board members listened in stunned silence as Jack and Aaliyah revealed how their seemingly chance encounter in his home years ago was actually the intersection of two family histories, two parallel stories of power and powerlessness. "Today," Jack concluded, "we're not just launching programs or initiatives. We're attempting to heal a wound that goes back generations. This isn't charity, it's restitution." Marcus, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, approached his parents. The ring around his neck caught the light, no longer just a piece of jewelry but a symbol of this complex history. "The ring stays with me?" he asked, looking between Jack and Aaliyah. "Yes," they answered together. "It's a reminder," Aaliyah added, "that healing is possible, that cycles can be broken." Jack looked at his son, then at Aaliyah, and finally at the diverse group of people in the boardroom. "This foundation isn't the end of our story," he said. "It's the beginning of a new one. A story where power is used to uplift, not to oppress. Where privilege becomes a tool for change, not a weapon of exclusion." The meeting that followed wasn't just about budgets and programs, it was about transformation, about acknowledging the past while building a different future. As they worked, the ring around Marcus's neck served as a constant reminder that sometimes the greatest changes come from confronting our deepest wounds. The story of Jack and Aaliyah, which began with an act of discrimination, evolved into something more profound, a testament to the possibility of genuine change and the power of confronting generational patterns of injustice. Their personal reconciliation became a catalyst for broader social transformation, proving that even the deepest wounds can lead to healing and hope.